Secrets of the Dead, the Shroud of Turin, revered for centuries as the burial cloth of Christ, until its authenticity was called into question.
The shroud contains iconography that is definitely post-1200.
But now, new forensic evidence may trace the shroud's origin back to the time of Christ.
Everything points towards this cloth having been used on the body of Jesus of Nazareth.
Is this relic the true shroud of Christ? Secrets of the Dead. Secrets of the Dead was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. Deep inside this cathedral lies the Christian faith's most revered religious relic, the Shroud of Turin. Bearing the pale straw-colored image of what appears to be a crucified man, the shroud has long been worshipped by many as the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. But there have always been questions about its authenticity.
From a medical point of view, it's very hard to find any physician that has studied the shroud that denies it being a burial cloth of someone.
Wrapping the dead in burial cloths was a Jewish custom during the time of Christ. The Gospels tell of Jesus' body being prepared in this way for his entombment. Could it be that this cloth bears his image? Investigation was cut short when scientists dated the shroud to medieval times. The backlash against further analysis of the cloth was considerable.
It had the sum total effect of shutting down all research by credible scientists who said, well, if the carbon dating says it's not old enough, then there's no point.
With the shroud declared a forgery, scientists and historians put forth many theories as to how the image came to be. There was even debate over whether the shroud could be the world's first photograph.
To do it, one would have needed a body. That person would more than likely have been dead because of the time needed for the exposure.
But in June 2002, everything changes. Technicians move the shroud to a secret location. The cloth is to undergo a major restoration. By chance, a Swiss textile expert, whose task is to renovate the cloth, unlocks its hidden secrets. Her remarkable findings once again trigger the question, is the shroud a medieval fake, or does it in fact date to the time of Christ? The Shroud of Turin measures just over 14 feet in length and is made from exceptionally fine linen. For its believers, the anatomically perfect impression on the cloth leaves them no doubt that it is a record of Christ's final hours leading up to his crucifixion. By piecing together the shroud's complex history, what can science reveal about its origin? The shroud is kept here in Turin, northern Italy, where it has remained for over 4 centuries. In 1998, the Catholic Church placed the shroud in a new high-tech container, a hermetically sealed case of aluminum and glass, from which air is pumped out and the inert gas argon is pumped in. Sealed with the papal stamp, the Church believed it was preserving the shroud for future generations. But even within the Church, there were doubters. Their belief had already been shattered when scientists first dated the cloth as medieval. Could the church stand by its claim that the cloth is truly a holy relic? Or had the Shroud of Turin been shown to be nothing more than an elaborate hoax? Carbon dating had been used to date the shroud in the 1980s. The new technology offered a seemingly foolproof way of fixing the date.
The expectation on my part and of other people was that carbon dating would really resolve the issue of whether this cloth was 1st century AD and therefore genuinely of Christ. So I was certainly pushing for it, and the church certainly recognized that there was a legitimate case for the shroud to be carbon dated.
On April 21st, 1988, the shroud was ready to go under the knife. But right up to the last minute, the team could not decide where to cut.
What I find quite incredible is that after all that had gone before and what had seemed a tremendous amount of delay, that it's when they actually have got all the scientists in actually there that they finally come to an argument between two Italians about where the sample should come from. And apparently this was very heated and went on for some considerable time before eventually a very bad decision was made about where the sample should be taken from. It was taken from one corner, a corner that we know historically was one of the corners that was used for holding up the shroud to the people in the time of these expositions, and therefore would have received more contamination than any other part of the shroud.
The samples were sent to Oxford University for dating. Professor Robert Hedges was one of the original team members.
The whole question of contamination is much more difficult to deal with, and there are situations where dates have come out because of contamination which aren't right. If one is trying to remove contamination from people touching their cloth, then the procedures we use are pretty good, but I would still prefer to have something that hadn't been touched rather than something that had been touched.
Despite concerns that the samples had been cut from the wrong place, the team was confident enough 6 months later to announce the results.
It was a very dingy room in the basement of the British Museum, and when I went in, there was this blackboard at the back of the scientists with the dates 1260 to 1390 exclamation mark.
Professor Teddy Hall was the Oxford University team leader.
I remember Teddy writing out the date in chalk on a backboard. I think he actually enjoyed the fact that the shroud was, you could say, shown to be a fake.
There are indeed still people who believe that the Earth is flat. There is still a flat Earth society going back to the time of Galileo. But of course, no sensible person listens to them at all. And I'm sure there will be some flat Earth people on the shroud as well.
The announcement made news around the world. The shroud was ruled a fake. Though the shroud's exact origin has remained a mystery, its medieval past is well documented. In 1578, Cardinal Charles Borromeo embarked on a pilgrimage from his plague-ridden Milan to the French town of Chambray, where the shroud was kept. To save Borromeo an arduous trip across the Alps, Duke Emmanuel Filiberto, a member of Italy's ruling family and the shroud's trustee, ordered that the cloth be sent to meet Borromeo in Turin. Borromeo was instantly captivated by the image on the cloth. With his blessing, Filiberto decided to hold a public showing of the cloth in Turin's Piazza del Castello.
1578, and Duke Emmanuel Filiberto had brought the shroud here in Turin for the very first time. He set up a beautiful pavilion here in this square. He had all the dignitaries from all around coming to this square, along with cardinals, archbishops, lots of clergy. And on this platform, he brought out the shroud, which was held out, not in any frame like they do today, but by the hands of the bishops. And the people, once they saw it, they immediately went absolutely wild. They were throwing up their rosaries, cannons were firing. It was a magnificent occasion, so successful, in fact, the Duke repeated it other times throughout his reign.
Public fascination with the shroud has hardly waned since that first showing in Turin over 400 years ago. Since that time, there have been many dozens of public expositions of the cloth, including this one in 1933. At each showing, the shroud has been exposed to air and sunlight and handled by hundreds of people. Though the church had taken steps to protect the cloth with the best that modern technology had to offer, the fibers surrounding the image were oxidizing, causing the cloth to get darker. The shroud's image was slowly disappearing. In 2002, under total secrecy, the church ordered vital restoration work to remove old repair patches that were thought to be causing the damage. Renowned textile historian Mechtild Fleury-Lemberg was considered the only person skilled enough to oversee the repairs.
This linen, normally, the beginning naturally, had been natural color and is also, in the meantime, oxidized. That means more yellowish. And this process is going on. And because we don't want the ground growing darker and growing together with the image, that would mean in the future the image would no longer be visible.
Remarkably, it was during this restoration that Fleury-Lemberg uncovered secrets embedded in the cloth that refuted the carbon dating results and pushed the date of the shroud back to the 1st century, making it possible that it was indeed the Shroud of Christ. In 1898, Italian photographer Secondo Pia was commissioned to capture the first images of the shroud on film. For centuries, admirers of the shroud had marveled at its faint image of a crucified man. No one could have imagined that a much clearer image was about to reveal itself. Pia exposed the light-sensitive glass plate and hurried back to his darkroom to process the picture. As the plate developed, it showed not a vague silhouette of a man, but an eerily lifelike portrait, revealing bone structure, blood, and other details that had never been seen before. Secondo Pia's discovery of the photographic qualities hidden within the image only enhanced the shroud's allure, because despite the rich detail revealed in the landmark photographs, still, no one could be certain how the image was created, or whether it was the impression of a real man. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin research project, called STIRP, was given unrivaled access to the cloth. One of the team's photographers was Barry Schwartz.
STIRP was a group of mainly American scientists, about 24 of us, and the purpose of the group was to determine what formed the image on the shroud. Now, of course, the theory was the shroud was a painting, so we took with us the tests that would normally be performed on art. The X-rays, for example. They use X-rays to determine if there's lead in the paints that are used. We used different types of spectral imaging. Again, the kinds of things that one uses to authenticate paintings. And of course, both infrared and ultraviolet photographic imaging, all of which are experiments geared towards determining how the image was formed on the shroud.
The team exposed the cloth to low levels of X-ray radiation. If the shroud was a painting, this process would reveal it. But STIRP detected no traces of pigment on the cloth. What they did find was that the pale yellow image only appears on the surface of the cloth's fibers. Indisputable evidence that it was not the work of an artist. The STIRP researchers emerged convinced that the cloth held the impression of a real man. Even more critically, they confirmed that the shroud was covered in bloodstains. Determining exactly what happened to the man on the shroud has been a lifelong obsession for forensic pathologist Fred Zugaby. For 50 years, he has been solving homicides on the streets of New York. What he has surmised about the man on the cloth is disturbing even for the hardened professional.
Features that you see are the marked injuries here. For instance, there's swelling above the eyes. There's marked swelling below the right eye and the cheek here, and some swelling below the left one here. As you can see, a separation of the bone and the cartilage from a blow to the nose. On the chin area, there's swelling on the chin area in this region. The hair is saturated with blood. There's blood saturation here. And these are injuries from the crown of thorns. Every time they hit him with the reed as they filed past him and hit against the head and the crown of thorns, these would puncture his scalp.
The scalp contains a network of highly sensitive nerves.
Now, a crown of thorns would irritate the trigeminal nerve. It's a lancing type of pain across the face, and it may stop suddenly. A wisp of wind may bring the pain on again. The pains are brutal, very difficult to handle, and some people have actually gone to shock and died from trigeminal neuralgia.
Zugaby believes that the image on the shroud is that of a real man who died a gruesome death. But his research still does not tell us how the image on the cloth was created. There are still some who believe the shroud is a clever case of deception. Dr. Nicholas Allen is an art historian at Port Elizabeth University in South Africa. He believes that the shroud is a forgery, and its image is that of a man who died in the 14th century.
By the time we come to the 13th and 14th centuries, the use of relics comes to an all-time high, where it developed into what could be described as a multi-million-pound industry.
Allen has his own theory about how the image on the shroud was made, that it is the world's first photograph.
To do it, one would have needed a body. That person would more than likely have been dead because of the time needed for the exposure, and that person would have had to be kept perfectly still. The person would have had to have been hung up in sunlight for at least 8 hours opposite a crystal lens, which had been placed in the aperture of a wall around a room, which we would now call a camera obscura, or a darkened chamber.
Allen claims that all the necessary tools needed to produce this image would have been readily available in the late 13th century.
All you would have needed at that time was somebody who knew how to make a lens, and there were plenty of people making lenses at that time. Somebody with some alchemical knowledge, because all you need is some silver sulfate, and a camera obscura, which is exactly what we have here today, set up as they would have done it in the 1300s.
With eyeglasses having been introduced to Italy in the late 13th century, lenses would have been available throughout medieval Europe.
This is a convex lens cast from a lens in the British Museum. That was made around about 150 Common Era, which would have looked something like this when it was new. And two of these lenses placed together make a condenser with which you can project an image.
Allen also believes that 13th century alchemists would have had a primitive understanding of photochemistry.
To capture an image, as you see on the screen behind me, is a relatively simple thing to do. But now to permanently capture that image, we have to make sure that the cloth that the image is being projected onto contains light-sensitive material. And what we're using here is silver sulfate, which was available in the 13th century.
Once Allen has made the silver sulfate solution, he soaks the linen shroud. Just like a piece of photographic film, the cloth is now light sensitive. He stretches it over a frame and opens up the aperture, exposing the cloth to his image. As the silver sulfate reacts with the UV rays streaming through the lens, an image is gradually burned onto the cloth. It will take about 3 days for it to fully develop.
The image that you see here is in effect a chemical scorch, and it only appears on the upper fibrils of the linen. If you turn to the back of this cloth and were to look at the back, there'd be no image here whatsoever. The image is only on the side that the sunlight struck the cloth. And like the Shroud of Turin, this image is not made from dyes, pigments or powders. It's just simply oxidized linen.
The positive image is very subtle, but as with Secondo Pia's negatives of the shroud, the ghostly face is markedly more defined when the picture is reversed. Allen believes the silver sulfate residue left on his cloth after drying would also be present on the Shroud of Turin, and could be used to confirm that the cloth is medieval.
There are microscopic amounts of atomic silver, pure silver, trapped in the linen. We could end this discussion for once and for all about how the shroud was made if the authorities would allow a non-destructive test on the cloth to look for silver content. Remembering in 1977, the Sturt Committee only tested up to iron in their tests. They didn't test for gold or cadmium or tin or silver. If they found parts per million of silver in the Shroud of Turin, it would prove that it had been through this particular technique.
If Nicholas Allen is right, then the carbon dating results are correct, and the shroud truly is medieval. But not all evidence supports the carbon dating. One of the Sturt team's tests was to photograph the shroud using ultraviolet photography, a forensic tool that opens up a world beyond the visible spectrum of our eyes. It revealed hidden evidence about the quality of the cloth in the area from which the carbon dating sample was taken.
Amazingly, when we look at the UV fluorescence photography of that area, the area where the samples were taken is dramatically different than the rest of the Shroud of Turin. Now, remember that in 1978, that particular corner of the cloth was irrelevant. It was 10 years before the carbon dating, so we didn't focus our attention there. Going back and looking at those UV fluorescence images today, we can see now that there is a dramatic difference in the color of the shroud in the area where the carbon-14 samples were taken, and that indicates a difference in physical makeup or content. So it's quite obvious just from the UV fluorescence photography that there is something anomalous about the area where the carbon-14 samples were taken from.
The corner from which the sample was cut appears darker than the rest of the cloth.
I think the carbon dating was skewed, and if any cause was responsible, that contamination, I think, has to rank high. In terms of deciding where the sample should come from, I don't think they took into account the evidence of history that that particular corner of the shroud had been so repeatedly handled, and the problems that might cause for the reliability of any carbon dating result.
Throughout its long history, the shroud has been passed down from generation to generation. Each public exhibition carried with it the risk of further contamination. The very corner from which the carbon dating sample was taken is considered one of the most handled parts of the cloth. Professor Stephen Mattingly believes that tiny bacterial microbes living on the fibers might have skewed the carbon dating result.
When you examine the microscopic appearance of the linen from the Turin Shroud, you can see microorganisms on the inside of the fiber as well as wrapped around on the outside. You can actually see cells. Microorganisms would really form a network within it, all around and through the linen material. Unless it's cleaned properly, the radiocarbon dating of the Turin Shroud probably is in error. It's really more modern than it should be.
If the presence of bacteria did distort the carbon dating, could the shroud actually have an earlier origin? One piece of evidence that could help turn back the clock is a set of 4 small holes located near one of the cloth's edges. Called the poker holes, their origin is not fully understood. Deep in the Budapest National Library lies the Prey manuscript, the oldest surviving text of the Hungarian language. Within its pages is an illustration of Christ being prepared for his entombment. The cloth that will wrap his body is clearly visible, but it is the degree of detail that has excited historians. The illustration shows the shroud's characteristic herringbone weave and 4 holes that appear to match the pattern on the shroud. All this is made more remarkable when one considers that the Prey manuscript has been dated to 1190, 70 years before the earliest carbon-14 date for the shroud's creation. But is there any physical evidence that could date the shroud even earlier? The answer may lie in the town of Oviedo, in northern Spain. Here, kept inside a silver ark, brought to the town from Jerusalem in the 6th century, there exists what many believe to be the sister cloth of the Shroud of Turin. For 20 years, Mark Guskin has used ancient manuscripts and documents to shed light on the shroud's elusive past.
Here in the cathedral town of Oviedo, in the north of Spain, there is a cloth that's been kept here ever since the cathedral was built, known as the Sudarium Domini, the Sudarium of the Lord. It's a blood-stained cloth that has no images on it, unlike the shroud, but in contrast to the shroud, it does have a very well-documented history. There are documents that take this cloth all the way back to Jerusalem, where it was seen in the 6th century by a group of pilgrims. It left Jerusalem at the beginning of the 7th century due to the Persian invasion, always fleeing. It was always one step ahead of danger, until it finally found a resting place in the kingdom of Asturias, the first Christian kingdom in Arab Spain. large silver-coated chest or ark that we can see here actually came from Jerusalem. The original box, it's incredible that it's still here. There's an inscription on the top that tells us what was inside it. Inside it were all of these smaller boxes that we can see around here. And inside the smaller boxes were all kinds of objects and relics, among which was the sudarium.
The sudarium is a piece of poor quality linen, much like a handkerchief, stained with blood and bodily fluids. Jewish belief dictates that the human soul is carried in the blood. When somebody suffered a violent death in Christ's time, a sudarium would have been wrapped around the face to catch the blood. Hidden from the public for a millennium, this dirty, creased cloth bears a pattern of stains similar to that of the shroud. And chemical analysis has revealed that the blood on the sudarium matches the blood on the Shroud of Turin.
We know that the central stain was formed by a body hanging in an upright position with the arms outstretched. The head was leaning to the right and also slightly forwards. Now, the sudarium was first pinned to the back of the head. There are actually pinholes in the original that shows how it was pinned into the hair. The cloth was then brought round to the front, and it came across an obstacle. The idea would have been to wrap the cloth entirely around the head, but what happened was that the head was actually stuck to the arm due to rigor mortis setting in very quickly after a traumatic death. Hence, the sudarium was folded back on itself in the first position like this, which is why we have the groups of parallel stains when this liquid seeped through the cloth. This wound here, the body was still alive when this blood came out of the back of the head. And if we overlay this part of the sudarium onto the same area of the shroud, then the actual shape of the stains fits in perfectly.
Although the sudarium lacks the detail of the shroud, Guskin believes it bears the image of a man's face.
We can see the stain that corresponds to the beard area. We're talking about a bearded male. We can see the base stain of liquid that came out through the nose, and how the other stains were formed when the first stain had dried. That's where we have different edges, and we can make all of them out. At a later time, the cloth was wrapped all the way around the head, and most probably tied in a knot here at the top. And then, when the body reached the tomb, what most probably happened was this cloth, the sudarium, could have just been very easily lifted off the head like that, rolled up on itself, as it says in the fourth gospel, and left to one side.
The earliest written reference to the Shroud of Turin dates back only to the 14th century. The sudarium's written record is far more complete, which has enabled Mark Guskin to trace its history further back in time.
This book here is the Book of Testaments of the Cathedral of Oviedo, and it's the most treasured manuscript that is still in the cathedral archives. And it's basically a collection of various documents of donations that were given to the cathedral over the years. And the most important thing, in other words, what confers on the cathedral the highest level of importance, is precisely the ark and the relics that were inside it, including the sudarium. And even better than that is that this is not the only document that tells us this story. There are various documents from various cities copied in various countries, all in different places. There are manuscripts in France, in Belgium, that tell us the story of the sudarium. This is a well-established history of this cloth that came from Jerusalem to Spain and has been in Spain since the 7th century, since the beginning of the 7th century.
In the 1980s, forensic tests carried out on both the sudarium and the shroud reveal that they contain the same AB blood type, found in just 3% of the global population. If the cloths wrap the same body, then at the very least, the shroud could predate the carbon dating by 600 years.
Laboratory tests have shown virtually without doubt that these cloths were used on the same body. It's not really a question of doubting the carbon dating, it's just saying it doesn't fit in with what we know. We don't need to doubt it, it's just wrong.
That the sudarium, a dirty piece of cloth with no monetary or artistic value, has been revered in this way suggests that it must have held special significance for the people who preserved it. Mark Guskin believes it holds the blood of Christ.
Everything points towards this cloth having been used on the body of Jesus of Nazareth. I know that we'll never be able to prove it scientifically and historically, but the same is also true the other way round. Nobody can prove that it wasn't.
Whoever's image is on the cloths, he must have suffered a traumatic death. 2,000 years ago, the Romans used crucifixion as the most humiliating form of execution. The victim was first tortured, and then either tied or nailed to a wooden cross.
The person would be tied to some object, maybe a pillar or something, and the individual would be lashed so many times.
The image on the shroud appears to have multiple lacerations.
Scourging was usually done as a prelude to crucifixion. Generally, they only scourged them a few times prior to it because they didn't want them to die beforehand. What they would do is they would take an instrument called a flagrum, which had leather thongs on it, usually 3, with bits of metal or bone at the end. The metal would penetrate the flesh, ripping nerves, blood vessels, and so forth. Generally, the individuals would go into absolute agony, some of them actually to the point of convulsions. The Shroud of Turin shows over 100 markings from these patterned injuries.
The most dramatic marks on the image indicate that the man was then nailed to a cross.
The Shroud of Turin shows the wound in the wrist area on the back of the hand. If the nail went through here, at the base of the thumb region here, it would emerge exactly where the Shroud of Turin shows it and would be in an extremely firm place that would hold several hundred pounds.
According to Zugaby, the nail would have struck the most sensitive nerves in the body.
It damages the median nerve, causing the person to have a condition called causalgia, one of the worst pains ever experienced by man. It's like lightning bolts traversing the arm. The pains are brutal, could send a person into shock.
By the time the body was removed from the cross, it was likely to be covered in blood and sweat. Microbiologist Stephen Mattingly decided to investigate if this bloody end could be responsible for creating the image on the shroud.
It really started when a physician knocked on my lab door and wanted to know if I'd be interested in working on a sample of the Turin Shroud. And I said, wow. As I became more interested in the shroud and I looked at the image, it seemed to me that we were looking at a transfer of microorganisms from the body to the linen surface.
Staphylococcus epidermidis are the most common bacteria found on human skin. They release a polymer that can adhere to cloth and leave a yellowish stain.
The body becomes very, very sticky because of the polymers and the material that these microorganisms produce. And When they become very sticky, then they will stick very efficiently to a linen surface. So when you pull it off, then you see a transfer of some of these microorganisms to the linen surface, exactly where they made contact with the skin.
Using bacteria cultured from his skin, Mattingly will try to imprint an image of his own face on a linen cloth. He believes the man on the shroud had skin primed for bacterial growth.
These bacteria grow best at body temperature, and we had a man that was bleeding continuously, providing the nutrients for these bacteria to grow. There was also sweat because of the exertion that he was undergoing, which allowed this particular staphylococcus to become predominant. And then we had the body staying alive during this whole period. So he served as a perfect incubator for the growth of these bacteria and allowed them to reach such high levels. The image on the Turin Shroud comes from the fact that certain molecules will pick up oxygen, and when they do that, they turn this yellow color. We see this everywhere. We see it where you see yellowing on your shirts, white shirts. This is due to bacteria that have been transferred from the skin to the linen surface, and on exposure to oxygen, then they will turn yellow.
Mattingly must remain perfectly still during this process. If he moves, the image will blur. He estimates the time of transfer to be 12 hours. When the cloth is first removed, the image is faint, but starts to darken with exposure to air and light.
I'm using a UV light to enhance the contrast between the dark areas and the light areas. You clearly see the eyebrow region right here, the forehead, the nose, the lips, and the chin area down here. It almost gives a three-dimensional effect here as you compare my lips here with the nose area and the eyebrows. The eyebrows are darker because that's where more bacteria were present, and where there was greater contact with the linen surface. What we see is a perfectly natural phenomenon. It obeys all the laws of science, physics, mathematics, chemistry, etc. It's not anything to be concerned about in terms of a supernatural event. This is a natural process.
But not all scientists agree. Dr. August Aceta has put forth what many consider to be the most controversial theory of how the image was formed. He intends to show that the image could have resulted from a burst of radiation from within the body that discolored the shroud's fibers. He believes the image offers proof of Christ's resurrection. To test his theory, Aceta injects himself with a radioactive material called technetium.
As the technetium goes throughout my body, it's important that we start scanning immediately.
A scanner that detects radiation passes over his body. It begins to piece together an image, but this is no ordinary snapshot. Aceta believes that the image on the shroud is like a modern X-ray, that bone structure in the head and hands are clearly visible. In Aceta's scan, his thumbs can be seen through his crossed hands. He believes these features are also visible on the shroud.
an average size hand, which I have when put upon the hand of the shroud, matches up perfectly. And when you take the hand away, you can see that he is missing the image of his thumb here, and we believe that the image of the thumb can be seen through the palm of the hand, and this is the image of the thumb, which our nuclear imaging research has reproduced, which you can see on the shroud. Well, remember that the shroud is on top of the hand here, so somehow the shroud is imaging through the hand and imaging the thumb, which is beneath the palm of the hand.
Aceta also believes that parts of the body that are not in contact with the cloth can be seen on the shroud. He subscribes to the radical notion that the image was created as the cloth fell through the body during what he believes was the resurrection.
What really is controversial with our hypothesis of image formation is that for example, for the shroud to see the thumb, which is underneath the hand, far away from the shroud, for it to see the teeth inside the mouth, even though the mouth is closed, or to see the hard palate behind the teeth, the image of the body, we don't believe necessarily went to the shroud, but we do believe that the shroud somehow collapsed in through the body to image deeper anatomical structures.
Apart from the image of a crucified man, the shroud is covered with numerous scars that suggest a turbulent past. The most obvious are large burn holes and water stains that run the length of the linen. Could these mysterious marks provide further evidence of the shroud's true age? On December 4th, 1532, a fire broke out in the French church where the shroud was then stored. The shroud had been folded and locked in a silver casket, and then hidden in a niche behind the altar, which was protected by a heavy iron grate. But as the fire grew, the temperature started to rise, and the casket began to melt. Molten silver dripped onto the shroud and began to burn through the layers of folded cloth before it was eventually rescued. Ironically, the burn holes may have given historians further insight into the cloth's past.
The very way these marks repeat actually enables you to say how the cloth was folded each time these incidents occurred.
This is how the cloth has to be folded to line up the pattern of burn holes.
This is the actual configuration there as Aldo has worked out. And this is where the drop of molten silver or whatever would have hit in the fire of 1532.
For centuries, the water stains were thought to be a result of dousing the 1532 fire. But they do not match the burn holes. Their pattern tells a different story. Shroud expert Aldo Gureschi believes that the water stains formed as a result of the cloth having been folded with accordion-style pleats.
This turns out to be a simple, effective, and ancient way of folding a sheet. If we place the sheet at this particular angle and put it into this replica jar, we can imagine that the condensation or penetration of water, when at this angle, could be the cause of these markings.
Gureschi believes the shroud was once kept in a clay jar similar to those found 2,000 years ago near the Dead Sea. This type of container was used for storing objects of value during the 1st century. He is trying an experiment to replicate the water stains. This is the corner of fabric that would have been immersed inside the jar. When the cloth is unfolded, the pattern of water stains does closely match that of the actual shroud.
So what we're seeing here is a very close representation of the watermarks as they occur on the shroud, as can be seen. And the interesting thing is that this does seem to be in a jar that was actually used because of the way the folding was not tight as in a box, but with that rather loose way that Aldo demonstrated. And so the idea is a sort of tall jar, very like the sort of jars that were used in Qumran for keeping the Dead Sea Scrolls and so on. So conceivably, looking back to the 1st century AD.
But the most convincing evidence linking the cloth to the 1st century came during Mechtild Fleury-Lemberg's recent restoration of the shroud. A leading authority on historic textiles, Fleury-Lemberg was shocked by the shroud's distinctive sewing style. She had seen such a weave only once before, in textiles discovered amid the ruins of the Middle East fortress of Masada, on the coast of the Dead Sea. The Masada cloths were dated to within 70 years of Christ's birth. This type of stitching has never been found in medieval Europe.
You see the seam which you can see up there is very carefully sewn. We can find examples in Masada of this kind of seam. All what we see in this aspect shows us that it was a precious piece.
With the shroud having been sewn in the same distinctive style as the 1st century Masada cloths, Fleury-Lemberg believes it could not be a medieval forgery.
The Masada cloth is 7 after Christ, where we can show this special seam, but it is the system of sewing which it can show. It's not to compare with this piece, of course, but the system of sewing was known, and it was especially done. You see, on the surface here, we have it completely plain, and on the back, we have the little seam, and it's so carefully done. They knew what they did. It is it is a professional work. I don't believe in this carbon 14 dating, especially because we have so many signs that this piece of linen is done in the 1st century.
If Fleury-Lemberg is right, then it is possible that this cloth could be the Shroud of Christ. But with so much conflicting evidence, the debate rages on.
For me, this image is simply a medieval piece of linen that I'm looking at. And it's a very important artifact because of the technology that's been used on it. And I don't think enough has been done to look at the technology that was used to make this image.
If it's the work of a forger, it is the most extraordinary, subtle piece of forgery out. And my problem is that I simply cannot see that in the 14th century there was anybody that would have had that degree of competence.
Based on new data that has come to light in particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, I think it's imperative that new carbon dating be done.
Science may yet definitively solve the centuries-old mystery of the Shroud's origin. But for its millions of Christian devotees, belief in the Shroud has never been a question of science, but rather a question of faith.